Just wait for that to start kicking in. So back in July 2024, Richard wrote an open letter to landlords acknowledging that window-related complaints often involve complex issues, but it's an area that not all landlords respond to in a timely way. And as I mentioned, Rick will be leading the session today to discuss this in more detail. So I'll hand over to you now, Rick, so you can introduce yourself and begin the presentation.
Super. Thanks so much, Victoria, and thanks to everyone for joining for this discussion around this really important topic. As Victoria highlighted, the impetus for this session is that letter I wrote just over 6 months ago now, and certainly during the discussion and the questions, it would be brilliant to have any reflections or thoughts that you may have had as landlords in relation to that letter and your experiences of this issue. The reason for writing was a consistent trend that we'd seen in our casework involving window-related repairs, particularly the decision whether or not to undertake a repair or to defer action until planned works happen. But obviously those planned works may not be scheduled for some time, or may also be subject to delay. So what happens in the meantime, and how do you manage potentially a hazard relating to the window and the occupant in the meantime? So that was the context for writing. If we go to the next slide, Victoria, what we'll do over the next few slides, there's not loads, don't worry, it's after lunch, you don't want lots of slides, there are tons, but what we'll do is cover a few aspects. The context, the primary lessons from that were shared in the letter, some case studies, and then look at kind of what's happened since over the last 6 months. I think it is very striking the number of children in all tenures who can be affected by issues relating to windows. The impact can not only be around immediate health and safety, for example, that risk of fall, but it can also, and you will see there has obviously been some very high profile, tragic incidents where that has been the case over a number of years now, and there were 2 incidents last year. Around the time that that I wrote that letter as well. But the impact can also be felt in a less stark way, but still be significant for households. So, for example, the loss of natural daylight if windows are boarded up for a period of time, or coldness in the property, or potentially the opposite, overheating in the property if the window's not functioning effectively. The Decent Home Standard obviously requires windows to be replaced over a period of time, of lifetime of typically of 40 years. And obviously where you've got windows in blocks, the cost of replacement can be significant. So it's not uncommon in our casework for us to see landlords deciding to undertake those replacements in a more cost-effective way when they do cyclical works or planned works to the block, rather than dealing with individual issues. What will come into focus, though, is obviously the existing hazards that were put in the 2004 Housing Act, and then will be given potentially greater discipline this year. We expect an announcement around Awab's law, is how do landlords handle their obligations under the Decent Home Standard, the cost effectiveness of planned works, but then the impact that window-related repairs might have for an individual household, and an assessment of the risk to that household, particularly in the context of the hazards and the expectations that could be brought in relating to Awab's law. So there's a number of issues there for landlords to unpick, But what's clear from the cases that we see is that across the casework, there are common concerns that residents are raising and common complaints that residents are raising. That means that landlords probably do need to focus in and think, well, what is our approach to windows, particularly since those works on decent homes may now be some time ago. And so these issues will become potentially more prevalent and come into focus. The final word before we move on to the next slide is I know many landlords will deal with issues around restrictors, for example. These can come up in our casework, but I think typically what we see in our casework is more relating to the deterioration of the window and the window frame, and therefore the risk of excess cold or water ingress and so on. If we move on to the next slide, please, Victoria. So there was a few lessons, and we've set out 4 that were contained in the letter. And if I just touch on each one, and this was based on a review of several cases and some case studies we'll come to in a moment, and there were others contained in the letter. So the first relates to that point I was making around obligations under the 2004 Housing Act and potential future obligations and expectations relating to Awaab's law, and that's assessing the circumstances of the household. So different, as you all know, under the hazards, a consideration needs to be given to the circumstances of the household because a risk could manifest itself in a different way depending on the composition of that household. So, for example, any health conditions or the age of the occupants. In too many of our cases, it was not evident that the landlord had undertaken a risk assessment and considered whether or not the issues relating to the windows presented a hazard and potentially a Cat 1 hazard, Category 1 hazard for the occupants. So there is something there about when and how do landlords undertake that assessment, and how do they ensure that they do so in a routine way which fulfills their obligations. Because too often in our investigations, landlords were unable to evidence and demonstrate that they had. The second area is the expertise that landlords rely on to make sound decisions on whether or not they need to undertake works, what works those need to be, and when do they, and by when do those works need to be conducted. And again, sometimes what we can see in our casework is a variable approach to surveying the issue and surveying the windows, whether that's done internally, whether independent experts are used, whether that information is shared with the occupant, who will obviously be asking questions, and then what the schedule of works are that arise from those surveys. There can be a disconnect between the survey, its recommendations, and then the schedule of works. And why is that? And landlords being very clear and interrogating why they're not following the recommendations that have been set out. There may be a rational reason not to, but how is that evidence and how is that demonstrated? In addition to that, there can, in some cases we see, be a tendency towards multiple surveys being conducted of the issue without clarity as to why additional surveys are being done, but then how they relate to the previous surveys, and then what the future works will look like. So instead you end up on this kind of carousel of different surveys happening without clarity on the actions which are arising from them. The third issue is that key one that was one of the main drivers for writing to landlords, which is the interface between responsive repairs and planned works. And we recognise the cost implications that repairs to windows can bring, the complexity that can come, the need to erect scaffolding and so on, and the obligations under the Decent Home Standard, which may drive a landlord to conduct works at a later date. But I think a number of things can come, and balancing these is a real challenge for landlords, and we recognise that. But I think a number of things can arise from it. The first is a clarity that a decision is made on the condition of the windows and the impact on the household and potentially the hazard that it presents to the household without the decision purely or solely being based on cost. The landlord needs to demonstrate that it's balanced all of those things and made a rational decision. There's then the need for the landlord to be really clear about the certainty that works will happen. And we have certainly seen in several cases landlords decide not to undertake repairs on the basis that there'll be future works, but those future works have been delayed and continue to be delayed. And in one case, we saw the landlord decide not to undertake works which should have happened last year because it was going to undertake future works, but those future works were planned in 2036. So how do you, as a landlord, ensure that you've got a rational approach to balancing that? The next challenge also is then, well, what happens in the meantime? What are appropriate mitigants in the meantime, and are those sufficient? And is that household in a position which is satisfactory? And then the final point here is that we have had, albeit a smaller proportion, but we have had some cases which relate to the installation of new windows and the operation of those windows and the communication between the landlord and the resident about those windows and ensuring that that information is accessible and comprehensive in terms of addressing potential safety risks, and also consider all potential occupants of the property, so the potential, for example, at relets and so on, to ensure that there are no risks that are not being controlled through that communication with residents around new windows. So if we move on to the next slide, please, we've got some case studies. So the first one involved a fault with the window, which meant that the window needed replacing, and the landlord in the interim decided to board up the window. The issue is that was then an experience for that household, and in this case, it was a window to a child's bedroom that was, excuse me, that didn't last for days or weeks. This went on for 4 years. In addition to that, which was obviously unreasonable in itself, was the circumstances of the household. So there was a respiratory issue which could be potentially exacerbated by this, as well as issues around damp and mold and controlling damp and mold in the property, which was compromised and less effective because of ventilation issues. Underneath all of this was, and perhaps and certainly one of the reasons why the landlord wasn't responding as effectively and timely as it should have been, was very poor knowledge and information management on the case. I have to say, windows being boarded up for a prolonged period is something that I see on a fairly regular basis in our casework, and so I don't think this is an isolated example. And I think that interaction with other issues is also one that I sometimes see in my casework. So, for example, there was a case a few weeks ago where, again, the resident is reporting damp and mold, but also reporting an issue with the window, and the landlord's decision was to screw shut the window, but then that created ventilation issues which compounded the damp and mold. So I think this kind of fragmented and siloed approach to handling different issues without thinking about the collective experience of the household and other issues being managed in the household is one of the pieces of learning that could be taken away from this. I think another key piece of learning from this case is what information is available to operatives and officers to make sound decisions and appropriate decisions, and why did the landlord lose sight of this case and these issues, and why did the complaints process itself then not enable it to fully recover the position and those missed opportunities um, 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 in the way that it handled it, because clearly what happened here was far outside what it would expect to happen under its policy. If we go to the next case study, so this case study also involves a broken window, and again, as you can see, there's a strong theme here around the fact that the home contained two children, two occupants who were not only children but also disabled. So again, if you're doing that risk assessment, there are different issues there that need to be considered in terms of then what's the appropriate intervention by the landlord. The one of the challenges, I think, in the way in which or issues in the way in which the landlord handled this case is a lack of clarity and some confusion around roles and responsibilities, and therefore the landlord advised the resident that it wasn't responsible for the repairs when it was very clearly under the agreement with the resident responsible for undertaking the repairs to the window, and that in itself mismanaged expectations, but also led to delays and a less timely intervention. Again, I think a really important theme which is emerging is landlords being really clear about the composition of the household, any inherent vulnerabilities within that household, and making a sound risk assessment to then help inform its decisions. If we go to the next slide, please, Victoria. So the letter was written last summer. A number of and three things to update on. So firstly, a number of landlords responded to that letter, and I think that's really positive and really welcome. And clearly, some landlords use that letter as a opportunity to review their approach, to consider some of the lessons, and also to look at, well, what's the nature of the casework that they're receiving and complaints that they're receiving on windows, any parallels with the issues raised in that letter, or any new issues perhaps outside what the cases that we're seeing, and how to approach it. Certainly in some cases, I know landlords have thought about revising their policies as a result of the letter and a result of their review of their caseload. The relationship between these issues and decent homes is one that we've alluded to, and we know that the government has committed to progressing with the decent homes review, and our expectation is that probably in the early part of this year we will see the government set out a consultation proposal on decent homes too. And then the third thing to say is, well, has anything changed in our casework? Are we seeing something different today than we did a year ago when we first started to think about writing to landlords in the way we did? The answer is yes, we continue to see, I think, many of the same characteristics in the casework that led to that earlier letter. Interface between responsive repairs and planned works, the issues around risk assessments and consideration of potential hazards, and then practices which are outside policy commitments, and why are they happening, particularly in relation to window-related repairs. I think our next slide is just how you can contact us. There we go. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rick. So we don't have any questions in the chat, but now's the opportunity. If you would like to ask Rick a question, feel free to pop something in the chat, or just to raise your hand in Teams using the raise hand icon at the top of the screen. Well done, Shonak, I think it is. Shonak Young, you were the first. Would you like to unmute and ask Rick a question?
Hi, Rick. Yeah, sorry, I'm not going to type in the chat because I fell over this morning and hurt my wrist. So I'm typing very slowly at the moment. Yeah, I just had a question because our organisation, I'm customer engagement at Live West, and we're just about to go out to procure a new windows and doors contract, and we're involving customers in that process. So I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of things that, based on sort of what you've seen, things that should be considered around procuring new windows.
Thanks, Shonak. Firstly, I hope your wrist feels better. Sorry to hear that.
It's all right. It's not too bad. It's just slow.
Yeah, no, it's good. Well, firstly, I think it's really interesting point that you raised about, well, actually, how do the lessons from casework potentially get reflected into a procurement exercise like that, and services that you're seeking to appoint? A couple of thoughts for you, bears more reflection, but a couple of immediate thoughts. I think the first is, depending on the type of works that they would undertake, I think that communication point with residents is really, really important about the functioning of windows. So if they are, replacing windows, will residents know how to use them, and particularly those health and safety issues that we've highlighted. And so what's going to be really effective communication here, and what's the responsibility of the landlord versus the responsibility of a contracted party? I guess the second thing is that kind of the knowledge and information sort of exchange between the landlord and the contractor as well, because I think one of the things that clearly you've seen in some of the cases is that records have been poor. Well, why have records been poor, and has a contracted party been involved, and is the right information transfer happening, and the right and records accessible? So I think those are probably two things which which I think arise from these cases, which could be reflected into any dialogue with a contractor.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The next person who's got their hand up is Andrew Thompson. Andrew, would you like to come off mute and ask Rick your question?
Yeah, in your presentation, you didn't mention the concept of sustainable development, carbon change, embodied energy in building materials, and this obsession with taking out perfectly functional windows just because they're 40 years old. It seems to be counterintuitive to what, in the built environment, we're being told that we should be aspiring to keep materials in our buildings, providing they are fit for purpose. And we can show you within the built environment lots of examples of properties that are hundreds of years old and still have their original windows in. It also, that there seems to be this assumption that all social housing is the purpose-built stock from the 1950s or whatever. In our portfolio, we have got a huge array of like properties, some of which are listed, some of which are in conservation like areas. So this approach of ripping out and replace, it doesn't fit in a whole nationwide diversity of what social housing is in 2025. Is there a reason why you're not thinking about sustainable development and the climate change issues in your response, or is it you've just targeted on, so we say, that the traditional, so we say, stereotypical social housing stock rather than the diversity of the modern portfolio?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's a really interesting series of points that you've made, and I think maybe a kind of couple of responses back to it. So I think the first is the focus for the letter is obviously derivative of the cases that we handle. So I think, you know, the scope of it and, you know, and you're right, it didn't really address sustainability issues, is really a reflection of, well, what are people bringing complaints to us about? What are they about? And what are we finding in our decisions? And I think those points were really outside what we were seeing in our casework. So the letter's reflective of the cases that we handle. There are, though, some cases which we see where I think overheating, there can be a strong focus on cold, excess cold, but actually overheating could, you know, does appear sometimes in our casework. And obviously that will have been often be a new build, and that will be driven by an intention around sustainability and carbon efficiency. But what you will see is, you know, potentially people struggling to operate or open the windows and at risk of overheating. On your points around kind of conservation and sustainability, I suppose kind of a couple of thoughts. I think firstly, yeah, accept and get your point about, you know, actually how do you build so that things can function beyond 40 years and you don't want to be in a cycle. I think typically what we're seeing in our casework is that windows may not be reaching that 40-year period and something has happened. So what do you do in the intervening period? Do you wait until that scheduled replacement, whether that's the right or wrong approach? If that's the approach, do you wait until then, or are there appropriate actions are there some actions that would be more appropriate to take now? So I think that was the tension in our casework. It wasn't that it was reaching 40 years, well, should it be replaced or not? It was the fact it wasn't reaching 40 years, but interventions may not be happening. I think the other thing about your point on street properties is, and actually perhaps pre-war stock, I think is really interesting. And I think one thought there is where we see window related complaints in those circumstances, often it will just be one aspect of the property's condition. So I think again there is a kind of that challenge for the landlord about, well, windows is one element, but actually there's a series of issues here, and these may be properties where we have multiple repairs. Well, how do you manage that? Because some really difficult choices there. You know, those street properties might be in you know, some of the least affordable, you know, places. That's important, but also it comes with potentially additional costs, but also you know, sash windows, conservation areas are additional complexities. That's a bit of a ramble, but I think the main point is the issue didn't really come up in our cases, so it wasn't really reflected in the letter.
Does that answer your question, Andrew?
Yes, thank you.
Lovely. Okay. We haven't got any more questions in the chat, and we haven't got anybody else with their hand up. So if you would like to ask Rick a question, feel free to do that now. Whilst you're thinking about that and raising your hands, I'm just going to put the link in the chat to the evaluation form for today's session. So please do fill that in. I can't see that we've got anybody. I've just put my own hand up there, but I can't see that anybody else has got their hand up, Rick. So, oh, hang on, we've got one in the chat from Nicola. So Nicola says, if older windows, so the 1960s, in high-rise blocks meet building regulations but still pose a hazard under HHSRS, should the landlord have a written risk assessment for all flats?
So on the cases that we see, if a household raises issues with the windows, then the landlord should be considering what happened, you know, their risk assessment in relation to that household who's you know, raised a complaint. I think there's then a decision for the landlord about whether or not he needs to consider, you know, go more wider than that individual case and look at other properties in the block and the impact on them, but that might be dependent on the nature of the repair that's required.
Nicola, does that answer your question? I don't know if you want to come off mute or just...
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that's it for the questions now then, Rick. So thank you very much for the presentation today and for answering those questions, and thank you very much everybody for attending. You're free to go.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.